I'm Dr. Anna Goodwin. I'm a medical oncologist practicing in Hamilton, New Zealand. My credentials were obtained in the United States, primarily where I got a fellowship in hematology and medical oncology, and I also became board certified in palliative care later in my career. My practice is primarily related to the treatment of patients with cancer and end-of-life issues. What did I originally think of fluoride? I grew up, as most kids in the United States, with a fluoridated water system in my community. In spite of that, I had a few cavities. My grandfather was a dentist, so I got my fillings at a young age. Then I went through medical school, and we never really were taught to question fluoridation in drinking water. It was just a fact of life, and I just accepted it. And I guess my epiphany came just several months ago. I'm really quite new to the whole fluoride debate, but I was attending a Grand Rounds lecture at the Waikato DHB that I'd had a very good relationship with over the last 4 years and had attended many Grand Rounds and found them very educational and usually very didactic. We could usually ask questions. This one was on fluoridation, and the meeting was prefaced by the moderator saying, if you are from the media, if you know anyone in the media, if you're planning to talk to the media, I invite you to leave right now. And there was just a stunned silence. And the two speakers were there, and I won't name names, but they've been quite useful to the pro-fluoride movement and defending the practice of water fluoridation. And I sat there and I watched the one speaker, and it somewhat reminded me of the book How to Lie with Statistics, because there were all these bar graphs that had no numerical data associated with them, so we knew not the sample size included. And I just began questioning, and when she finished speaking, there was not any room for questions. We weren't allowed any questions. There was no discussion. The next speaker came up and kind of gave us all the stuff that we'd heard our whole lives, and it was more like, you know, this is our spiel, and you as DHB employed physicians need to stick to it. And so I went away from that meeting thinking, oh my gosh, what do they have to hide? Why did they think this was necessary? And so I got reading about fluoride, and I hadn't really bothered to question the data before, and suddenly there it was. I mean, it was just rather stark how little evidence we had to support the fluoridation of drinking water, especially with fluorosilicic acid, which is an industrial waste product. There's been no human studies on fluorosilicic acid, and I was horrified. And so I wrote the Fluoride Tribunal and said I'd like to present, and I started collecting evidence, and I just started getting madder by the day at the whole thought that industry and government could hold hands and they could think, wow, we've got this industrial waste, and we'd really rather not pay to have it disposed of properly, so let's just put it in the human drinking water. And that I found to be quite outrageous. And yeah, I think that's what set me off. And so I think it's very wrong. Am I aware of any studies of fluorosilicic acid showing it's safe, or of fluoride? And I would say that there are different types of fluoride, but for today's discussion, I think we should confine it to fluorosilicic acid, since that is the product, or spectrum of products, I should say, that is used to fluoridate municipal water supplies. And it has several different names. In fact, it's actually 20 different products that are in the realm of hexafluorosilicic acid, hydrofluorosilicic acid, fluorosilicic acid, fluosilicic acid, and on and on. And they're such reactive compounds that they kind of function as a milieu. They're not a pure product. And the data I could find on this suggests that it was never tested in humans, never intended for human consumption, and the fertilizer industry is allowed to sell it with up to 200 milligrams per kilo of arsenic and lead, which are unequivocally toxic to human beings. And I don't care how many times you can say that the dilution makes the poison. It's the low-level chronic poisoning of human beings that I think is probably contributing to a lot of diseases, including cancer. We know that arsenic and lead are carcinogenic. I have this article here from Kathleen Thiessen, Evidence of Carcinogenicity of Fluoride in Its Salts. She bases some of her data on Bisson, which was, she was one of the first to report osteosarcoma in young boys, and realized that it was actually an age-dependent time of exposure that created the risk. Because cancer doesn't usually develop overnight unless you have a really lethal dose of radiation. It takes years to develop cancer, so there's always a lag time, and most of the studies have been somewhat underpowered to detect a difference in cancer, and they've also been done measuring fluoride at the time of cancer diagnosis, which is a little bit erroneous. In the body of this report, she cites several articles where they actually have found higher levels of fluoride in men with osteosarcoma. And again, association doesn't mean causation, but there's a mounting amount of evidence, and there's also been corroboratory evidence in rats that develop osteosarcoma with long-term fluoride exposure. What dose of fluoride is too much, and what would cause a poison reaction? Again, that comes back to the type of fluoride. You can ingest somewhere over 3,500 milligrams per kilo of calcium fluoride, which is a very stable salt of calcium and fluoride. You could not ingest that amount of hydrofluosilicic acid or fluorosilicic acid or hexafluorosilicic acid. That would be lethal in very small amounts. And the Los Alamos National Laboratory in the United States is one of two laboratories that's charged with making weapons-grade uranium, and fluorine and fluoride are used in that extraction process. And during World War II, that's where most of our fluorosilicic acid came from. It's very interesting that fluoridation of the drinking water came along about a couple of years after World War II, because they had this huge stockpile of fluorosilicic acid that was derived from making uranium. And they didn't have really good containers, and it actually erodes concrete, it erodes glass, it has to be kept in a double-lined plastic container, and so it's quite corrosive. It's one of the most corrosive substances on the planet. And you could imagine the public health service holding hands with the military and creating a whole new market for this product that they had lying around. Fluoride is fluoride. And the data prior to that was actually generated with calcium fluoride, which was really a fairly safe product and actually might be slightly beneficial to bones, certainly not detrimental in usual quantities that we would be exposed to in our environment. Do we need fluoride supplementation? No, I think we get plenty of fluoride on our own just by our environmental exposures. But back to the Los Alamos project, their employee handbook suggests that 0.1 part per million in an 8-hour time shift is about all anyone ever needs. Our drinking water has 0.75, at least it did in Hamilton, and there are human cell culture experiments that suggest that 0.5 parts per million can increase the risk of malignant transformation in cell culture. So I would say 0.5 is too much. If we go by Los Alamos data, 0.1 is too much. The ambient level in our drinking water is actually 0.2 parts per million. So if we do nothing else to our water, we're still getting 0.2 parts per million in our drinking water. And yeah, I think we have more than enough to cope with, considering it's not a nutrient, we don't need it. Our body does have the ability to cope with a lot of toxicity, but why add something else? We don't need it. I think the issue of informed consent is very important, and it's been incredibly lacking in this grand forced experiment called water fluoridation. And I don't think that we'll ever have true informed consent, because this is just sort of an innocuous thing taken from HAZMAP, which is an internet informative site on chemicals. I can imagine myself sitting down with an informed consent page saying, we're inviting you to participate in this experiment. You're going to be given a colorless liquid with a sour, pungent odor. It's corrosive to your skin. High inhalation exposure can cause pulmonary edema. There's potential for fluorosis after chronic ingestion or inhalation of the aerosol. Chronic exposure hazards include osteofluorosis, respiratory impairment, and injury to your liver and kidneys. Chronic exposure may cause changes to bone, corrosion of mucous membranes, coughing, shock, pulmonary edema, fluorosis, coma, and death. It can also cause burns and may cause corrosive injuries to your upper respiratory tract and lungs. And on top of that, it doesn't really do a good job of protecting your teeth at the doses that we're going to give it. You don't mind participating, do you?